Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à la faculté des sciences sociales de l'Université d'Ottawa, qui se trouve sur le territoire non cédé du peuple algonquin. Et merci d'être ici en si grand nombre. My name is Patricia. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa. I'm also the holder of the Tellier Chair in Business and Public Policy. And I'm one of the co-organizers of this event with my colleague from the Faculty of Law, Wolfgang Aschner, and I'll come back to Wolfgang. So today we have the privilege of listening to a select group of experts who come to us with diverse expertise and experiences to talk about a very, and I guess, the fact that this room is full means that it's a very topical issue. The reshoring, friendshoring, decoupling of supply chains, and what that means for Canada. These are obviously questions that we in Canada are pondering, but I know that a number of you represent diplomatic corps, so you're also grappling with the same issues for your countries, and so hopefully some of the insights that will be shared here will be of value to you. Cet événement a lieu en anglais, même si l'Université d'Ottawa est bilingue, simplement pour faciliter la discussion. Mais lors de la période de questions, si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, sentez-vous très à l'aise. Et puis, on pourra toujours les traduire en anglais. So this event is presented to you by the Center for International Policy Studies, the Tellier Chair in Business and Public Policy, the Hyman Soloway Chair in Business and Trade Law, and Wolfgang is the holder of that chair, and the International Political Economy Network, all at the University of Ottawa. So now I'd like to officially introduce Wolfgang, who will be moderating this panel. So Wolfgang Aschner is a professor in the Faculty of Law, as I mentioned. He is the holder of the Hyman Soloway Chair. He's an expert in international economic law and trade and investments. He actually wrote a book on investment treaties, which was published last year. Wolfgang asked me to say that a little bit of advertisement. I could have done that at the end, but I'll probably forget. So I'm doing it now. On May 24th, Wolfgang and Gabriel Marceau from the World Trade Organization are organizing a public panel on WTO dispute settlement reforms. So you will look for the invitation. It will come very soon, but for anyone who's interested in those issues, this will also be a great discussion, I'm sure. So Wolfgang, à toi. Merci.
So hello and a warm welcome also from my side. Thank you very much, Patrick. It's a delight to co-organize this event with you. As you noted, a full room really attests to the importance of this subject, this topic. The world economy and international trade law is changing rapidly. And one of the areas where we see this change crystallizing maybe possibility is in the way that our perceptions of supply chains have shifted and changed dramatically. Just a few years ago, supply chains were something that nobody really talked about, at least not in academia, public policy, because it was really the boardrooms where these types of decisions were made, how to allocate resources, where to invest, and how to structure these types of supply chains. But now everybody is talking about them, and for good reason. Pandemic, the question of Russia and Ukraine, and other world events, we've seen that supply chains are very vulnerable, and governments are increasingly diversifying supply chains so that they have access to essential goods. They're also worried about the national security implications of having supply chains that there are countries or other types of risky environments. And finally, we are also talking more about resilience. So what happens if the outside change comes? How can we respond and fight back? And in this context of diversification, resilience and national security, there are really three key themes that pop up all over the place and that we want to investigate. The first one is the ability to bring supply chains back home. Second, the ability to, in instances, it's possible to bring supply chains back home to make sure that on sensitive issues and sensitive products, and source those allies and friends. And finally, to reduce dependencies on countries in the soda line, coupling. So reshoring, friendshoring, coupling are going to be the topics today. And obviously they are super big. And as we see from the turnout in this room, this is perhaps the start of the conversation on the standpoint. And that's why today we really want to focus on one thing. That is the electric vehicle supply chain, critical minerals, both to structure and of course, on one hand, there are wonderful benefits that come with this shift. We are living in a climate that's stress, kind of crisis. So the shift to electrification can help us get the upper hand in this fight against climate change. But at the same time, there are all a lot of costs, risks. This last week, we heard about Volkswagen is going to build an EV battery plant in Ontario. That comes with a big bill. The energy transition costs money, right? It's subsidies. It also comes at other types of costs, environmental costs, in order to mine critical minerals. We first have to get them on the ground, which is a big field on this. What we want to do today in this panel is to look at some of these opportunities, but also some of the risks. And I'm delighted that we have a panel that is offering a diverse array of perspectives from the public sector, from academia, and from the private sector to enlighten us on these. I'm very much looking forward to learning from them and with them. And so without any further ado, let me introduce our panelists here who will think about what these paradigm shifts mean, what Canada's role is. Canada being a reliable partner. Change. I will introduce them as they are seated next to me. So first on my right is Dr. Marie France. He was the Chief Economist and Director General, the Trade Analysis Bureau at Global Affairs. Marie France has been privileged or challenging position to have witnessed this transition over the past 6 years from the mindset where supply chains are really something to talk about, because I think they are on our minds, which is very important. The CUSMA, the rotating of CUSMA, and team is working hard on assessing on the impacts of shifts that we are addressing. I should say that I will just highlight a couple of elements for each of the speakers, and will make full so we are very glad that we have speaking impact of friendshoring and reshoring economic perspective. Then next to Marie France is Professor Nicolas Lamb, who is also the public policy school there. Nicolas is a trade lawyer, but the reason why we are especially delighted is that he has all this book, which, unbeknownst to me, actually have at least 3 copies in the room. And I it's really a remarkable perspective that he and his school of Anthony Roberts provide in this book, 6 pages of visualization. If you haven't seen it, I've looking at it. So he'll be telling us more about how these different narratives have changed. Next to Nicolas is Patricia, who is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at uOttawa. Patricia had a stellar career in the public service with leading roles across many different sectors and departments, most notably, and again, I just highlighted a few here. Patricia heads the Office of Energy Efficiency and Natural Resources Canada, was most recently Canada's ambassador on climate change. Patricia will focus specifically about the environmental aspects of this change in environmental protection. Finally, next to Patricia, we have Harrison, who's a partner of the both of this. Martha is really in the weeds of this as she's facing how businesses are responding to friendshoring and reshoring. And is one of the few practitioners who has enlightened us in the recent blog post the implication of friendshoring that I also highly recommend you. Last but not least, we have Cheryl Clay, who's the Director General Advanced Manufacturing and Industrial Strategy Branch at IPEN Innovation and Science. And so if there's one person who's really important, perhaps the most important person in this room is Cheryl, because she ultimately told us much of the burden of how public sector should respond to these unprecedented challenges. I think we have a stellar panel here. We are going to have a bit of a discussion in 2 rounds amongst ourselves for about an hour. Without further ado, let me jump into the first round. So, Nicholas, you have recently published, that I already mentioned, 6 Days of Globalization. You started off with a big picture view of where we are at, where globalization is heading, and how the issues of reshoring, friendshoring, that's probably
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Thanks so much, Patrick, for having me here. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about where we are coming from, because change is happening so quickly, we sometimes don't remember how different things used to be. And so one way of thinking about
I think I'll have.
Okay, good. The next slide. So one way of thinking about where we are coming from is to remember the narrative that was really dominant for 30 years that followed the end of the Cold War, and Anthea and I call it in the book the establishment narrative. And what's striking is that in that narrative, the terms that we are talking about today did not appear. They were just not part of the vocabulary. And why was that? Well, the narrative pointed out that we are on this fantastic hockey stick of global prosperity that brings us to ever unseen heights of productivity and wealth. And the question is, well, why would we disturb that? Why would we not pursue further international economic integration? Why would we think about reshoring or decoupling, which would disrupt us and bring us less wealth? There was also this idea that if we had further economic integration, that would lead to peace. That had huge implications for whom we were willing to trade with. So that's why friendshoring wasn't part of the vocabulary, because we were trading with everyone, either because they were already our friends or because we were hoping that if we trade with them, they would become our friends. And so there was it doesn't make sense to differentiate between friends and non-friends under that narrative. But as shown in the book, this narrative has been challenged by a number of different perspectives. And I want to highlight 3 that are particularly important to our discussion today. So one was the one that came to the fore with the Trump administration, which adopted a very different perspective on globalization. Not one where we are all growing the pie and getting a bigger piece, but where some people or some countries are robbing others of their jobs. You see here this from Peter Navarro's film, how the ships are shipping the jobs, stealing them from the United States and bringing them to China. And the idea here is that there's value in having certain types of jobs in our country. We can't be agnostic about where manufacturing happens, for example, because if we don't have steel jobs or all manufacturing jobs, people are suffering, communities are getting destroyed. And you see that on the graph on the right that shows so-called deaths of despair in US manufacturing communities, where people turn to suicide, drugs, and alcohol because they lose the basis of their livelihoods. And so from this protectionist narrative, we have this idea that we need to bring these jobs back home. We can't have a healthy country, we can't have healthy communities if we don't have certain manufacturing jobs. Another narrative that also came to the point in the United States in the last couple of years was a particularly focused one, which was noticing that globalization was allowing China to overtake the United States. And it was also pointing out that interdependence with people, with countries that are not our friends or whose governments we don't trust creates security risks. And there's probably no company that exemplifies that more than Huawei, and the decision by many Western countries to not allow Huawei to build 5G infrastructure, even though that would really have been the most economical and cheapest and technologically best option, simply because there was a realization that the interdependence that would follow would create vulnerabilities. And then finally, we all know about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it sent public officials scrambling for, sorry, that's the next slide, sent public officials scrambling for personal protective equipment and vaccines, how it led to supply chain shocks. This is the port of Shanghai and all the ships piling up there. And so with these critiques of the efficiency-based establishment narrative, we come to a picture where these terms that we're going to talk about today are suddenly making sense. So if we just click through those next couple animations. So if we put these three narratives into the Venn diagram, we see the protectionist narrative wants to bring good manufacturing jobs back home. The resilience narrative wants to ensure control over its essential supplies. The geoeconomic narrative wants to decrease vulnerability vis-a-vis a strategic competitor. And so then we can see why these terms make sense. So the next one, reshoring, is something that makes sense for all of these reasons. You bring jobs back home. You have more control over supplies if they are manufactured in your own country. You also make sure that you're not dependent on a strategic competitor. But there are also alternatives to reshoring. And so one of them is friendshoring. And it doesn't make sense if your real concern is with the manufacturing jobs. But if you're mostly concerned about your resilience, or if you want to make sure you're not depending on a strategic competitor, then friendshoring is an attractive option. And so suddenly we can see why there's this embrace of friendshoring, both by the Biden administration, but also by the Canadian government, because it means the alternative is reshoring. And it's in many ways a more attractive alternative, because you can say, we're not protectionists, we're not like Trump, just want to make sure we're resilient and not dependent on China. But on the other hand, and the next one, if you're more in the Trump camp and also adopt a very zero-sum perspective on the US-China relationship, then decoupling may also make sense, because you want to you adopt a zero-sum view of manufacturing jobs. You know, it's either going to be in China where the auto manufacturing happens, or it's going to be in the United States. We want it to be in the United States, so we have to do everything to bring it back. But you could also justify that from a security perspective. So I think the reason we're seeing these terms coming to prominence is because they are in the areas of overlap between these three potent critiques of globalization that has come to the fore in the last 6 years. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That was an excellent entry point here for our discussion. So let's try to put some numbers on this, because obviously we've seen a lot of activity, especially in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act, the subsidies that are attached to it in order to reshore and also to friendshore. So I would turn to Marie-France. What are some of the implications of that for? Do we see trends on the ground when it comes to reshoring, friendshoring, or these yet to be seen in the data?
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I hope it's not lost on you that the trade lawyer is the one who showed up with graph and the economist is without graphs today. So, okay. I thought it was kind of fun, but so in terms of reshoring, so let me go back. So you talked about the pandemic and the resilience and all this craziness around PPE and whatnot. And that's when we start hearing the calls like throughout about we need to reshore. So that was the narrative. We need to reshore. The proof is we can't get the PPE. People were completely, not thinking the fact that, well, this is just a huge demand shock that in the system behind can just increase production fast enough, right? So that was not a proof that we needed to reshore everything. And we worked hard, and other people worked hard, same thing, saying maybe we want to put things in perspective and to try to take the narrative away from we need to reshore to maybe we want to reshore certain things, right? And that's a very different discussion. So we go from looking at everything to maybe looking at a few things, but what those few things should be, or could be, that's a different kind of analysis. It's very different. That's exactly why we were hoping the discussion would be going. And that is kind of what we see right now, right? So it's like, it's trying to find what, in your economy, what goods, you're most vulnerable for critical inputs and things like that. And what is of critical importance. So if you don't get it and you're vulnerable, then you think about how to improve resilience, right? So that's a very different kind of discussion. And that's exactly where we were hoping things would be going. So to the question, do we see reshoring? Is there any evidence? So people were happy initially to say, oh, we found a data point somewhere, right? So some of you might recall seeing a study from Kearney initially that said, there's reshoring evidence to the United States. And then you kind of look a bit how they looked at the calculated numbers, and well, maybe not the best idea. So then they refined their study. So let me go back to Canada for a minute and say the way we're looking at it. So in the manufacturing sector, so we do simple ratio, and we look at manufacturing imports in real terms, and we divide that by manufacturing shipments. So ideally, in order to declare there is some reshoring, you would have both a reduction in those imports and an increase in domestic shipments. So your ratio would be going down. You would say, ha, I do have reshoring, right? So when you do that for the Canadian manufacturing sector up to 2021, actually, there's no evidence of that, right? So that is the aggregate number, okay? So of course, then you kind of look down and say, yeah, but the average, so it hides it, maybe the extreme, so what's under the hood, right? So we looked, and we looked, and we looked, and we didn't find a lot of reshoring evidence, okay? So there's a tidbit here. So sometimes the ratio will go down, but you look at the two metrics, the numerator and denominator, and it's like, oh no, that's not really reshoring, right? So for us, for Canada, there's no big evidence, no big trend. And it's not surprising to me, right? In terms of reshoring, okay? For the US, so Kearney has changed their analysis, and they've gone back and they do the same kind of thing, imports over manufacturing shipments. And then they say, yep, there was a decrease in the ratio for the good reasons that I mentioned in 2019. But 2020, 2021, ratio is back up. Offshoring again in aggregate. Okay, so I'm not saying that nothing is being reshored, but I'm just saying there's no evidence that this is a big phenomenon, a big trend happening, and that's the proof we fixed the problem or something like that. None at all. Okay, so that's what we know for now. Initially, when you start looking at it in the middle of a pandemic, you have data. There's always a lag, right? And you're like, well, we'll see when we get the 2020 data, 2021 data. Okay, but right now we still don't see any big evidence. Now, if you read the World Economic Outlook from the IMF, like I do, and my folks on my team as well, they'll say, aha, they found some evidence. Okay, so what they've been looking at in one of the chapters, and they do acknowledge, geopolitical tensions seem to have had an impact on FDI and whatnot. Okay, so what they do is they look at greenfield investments, and greenfield investments, it's brand new investment. It's not like, company comes in, buys something that already exists and changes the production line or something. So you start from scratch, you invest millions of dollars in a new plant or something like that. So they looked at that and they said, it seems like, there is evidence that money is flowing out of China and going to other countries. Could be some neighboring countries and so on. Okay, so they looked at greenfield investments and they compare actually, so it's 2020 Q2 to end of 2022, okay, to pre-pandemic, an average of 2015 to 2020 Q1. Okay, so it's the pandemic time, if you will, compared to pre-pandemic, and they say, okay, we see really an outflow of an investment out of China to neighboring countries and other places. However, so this is based on FDI markets, and FDI markets is not realized investment. Okay, it's announcements, very different. So we use it as well, right? Because sometimes you need to get the data where you can, but you have to keep in mind that these are plans, these are announcements. So that's what companies plan to do. And then it remains to be seen after if actually in the data we will see that has been done. Okay, so and announcements, that's what it is. And then you can also look at flows in stock. So flows of FDI, of course, vary quite a bit from year to year. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. And even if you look at the stock of US FDI in China up to 2021, there is no sign of this going down. So that's interesting. So things might be moving out. And you've heard about, you can probably name me a few companies that have decided to go out of China and go into Vietnam or Thailand or wherever. But in aggregate, because the level of stock is so high, it would take a bit of time before you really see that kind of coming back. So not a lot of evidence for that.
Thank you very much for putting us into perspectives and into some numbers, and also for pointing out that there might be different stories here depending on the sector. That's something that you might get. Now, let me turn to Patricia, because probably the elements that make this so complicated is that there are lots of tensions in here. There are tensions potentially between reshoring and friendshoring, so by factory goes to the United States, it may not go to Canada. So there's an element of potentially green protectionism in there, where industrial policies not only really to green the economy, but to green the local. On the other hand, that's of course good for the climate. So can you unpack some of the tensions, especially when it comes to the EV sector, and the tensions maybe also between reshoring and friendshoring?
Thank you, Wolfgang, and the debate today and with the very expert. There we go. Okay. Pleasure to be here today. I'll focus in on the IRA, and I think when we talk about the threat of green protection, the concerns have been focused around the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. So I think the good news here is that the IRA meant that the U.S. urged to change. They had maturity to the Paris Agreement with the level of Biden office. The return of the U.S. to that agreement certainly meant greater forward movement in the fight against climate change. And the world was waiting to see what would they do with their domestic policy, and the answer to that. So from that perspective, it was treated very positively globally initially, until countries began to look a little bit more closely at provisions. And essentially, to say, as described by Nicholas, the economic security concerns, the creation of jobs in the United States, those forces combined to break through what was essentially a political block and climate policy, and resulted in an act which is replete with domestic content requirements. So if we look specifically at the electric vehicle provisions, the $7,500 subsidy for EVs is contingent upon them being assembled in North America, and contingent upon a rising percentage of sourcing of critical minerals and battery assembly. So those percentages rising fairly rapidly over time to 80 to 100%. Respectively, for critical mineral sourcing and battery assembly. And for critical minerals, there is the provision that it can come from the U.S. or a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. So we can contrast this to Canada's $5,000 subsidy for electric vehicles, which about half if you compute the currency conversion to the U.S. one, but also no restrictions on content. So this certainly is a different approach than what we've seen globally around stimulus or EVs. But the security imperative is one that Canada certainly does share. As the IEA stated in a report last year, today's battery and mineral supply chains revolve around China. China produces 3/4 of all lithium-ion batteries and is home to 70 or 80% for cathode and anode production of battery components, and over half of lithium, cobalt, and graphite processing and refining capacity is located in China, and around half of EVs are assembled in China. So we share the US concern that as we enter into this fundamental energy transition, and as the global economy moves to electrification, we cannot be dependent on China for a critical part of this supply chain. So Canada is also fortunate in the provisions of the IRA. You're essentially in the tent. We had to fight hard to get there with the provision of the North American Assembly. That was credit to our diplomats and our leadership that we were able to get that changed from US to a North American requirement. But Canada has always been a believer in the WTO and the free trade rules-based system for good reason. We are a country which has done well in a liberalized rules-based approach. So in a world of competition based on might and based on deeper pockets for subsidies, we should have some concerns. Now, so far, things are going quite well. We've attracted a number of mandates for battery and EV related production in Canada. Most recently, they announced the promise, effectively matching US support. That's a combination of matching with other positive aspects of our investment environment. But if we look longer term and bigger picture, I think we do have to be concerned about the WTO consistency of the approach represented by the IRA, and I think it remains to be seen if that will be tested, but likely the provisions would be found to be consistent with that fundamental provision of international trade law and the WTO that domestic content requirements are antithetical to the goals of free trade. So how we as a country faced with this kind of environment respond to that? I think that part of the answer and a better place to get to in terms of international trade rules around this energy transition would be high standards, transparent and high standards for both environmental considerations as well as labor standards and human rights. We all like to, if we have not yet purchased an electric vehicle and we get to that stage of being able to do so, if you could know what is the embodied emissions in that vehicle, what standards have been produced to. Certainly, this is a basis upon which Canada and our friends can compete. We look at the climate change problem more broadly. We want China to reduce its reliance on coal-fired electricity. So a market which drives towards lower emission footprint for vehicles is one that will push China to reduce its emissions footprint and be a good basis on which we compete. And if we take about the global tensions that this trend to green protectionism can create, we also have to think about the global south, looking at the context in which there's they're experiencing debt distress, impacts of climate change, and a less than anticipated distance in certain climate impacts. So if you layer onto that picture in which the global north is seeing the benefits of energy transition in terms of these industries being developed in the north, that's problematic as well. So I would assert that we need to encourage much greater focus on standards around EVs. There's been references to standards in all of the declarations, Canada, US, our critical areas strategy. You can see it everywhere, but not a lot of work happening there yet. So I think that's an area of focus.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I think you highlighted a couple of interesting tensions here, but the last one, global south and global north, Friendshoring and reshoring. Missing made them personally. Second tension that you outlined, I think at least implicitly, is between values and values, or might cost a little bit more in order to get these standards combined with get additional benefits that are not maybe reflected by and finally, and I think that's something we also want to connect this question being multilateralism. At the same time, also watching out for your own interests and not being always covered on the blocks and pushed around. So interesting tensions there that we want to connect to. True. But let's continue setting that up here before we dive into these issues with Cheryl. Said earlier, Cheryl was really spotlight here in this panel, being the one who has to help the government implement it. So part of the challenge is that for a long time governments was out of the picture, but now industrial policy is on the forefront again, and government suddenly has some decisions that it didn't have to make for a long time. So how is government responding, and how is it moving?
Thank you so much. It's great being here and great taking such a full room. Let me start. I might refute a few of you in what you said, and maybe just that's coming from the lens from which I undertake work on behalf of the government of Canada. I would say Canada is actually never really making space, government specifically, in terms of how we're establishing, the market conditions and an attractive economy in which investment can be, in which investment can be made more complete in the country. There are different stripes of government, different political orientations, but certainly each of those have had their perspective, their point of view. In 2017, Canada announced, a very comprehensive new shift in industrial policy, which was known as the Innovation and Skills Plan, and that has since adjusted, grown, shifted, etc. So it's been quite some time that we've taken a look at what our toolkit is and how it is we've adjusted our microeconomic position in order to place in a very competitive business environment. The role of government, though, it does shift, and it absolutely depends on the global context in which we're existing, and then what's happening domestically. So both of those dynamics really need to speak to each other. The point at which I would argue maybe a little bit of a difference is I actually believe that the retrenchment and maybe a shift in globalization began probably 08, 09. With the economic downturn. I actually see the rise of protectionist measures increasing at that point and moving into ever more present visible manifest. It might not have really hit a meter such that it would create a risk orientation that way. Indeed, Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, made a speech indicating that in and around the beginnings of COVID-19. Many people think that COVID-19 was a big precipice in terms of did we see fissures in supply chains? And again, I would argue that those structural issues that we experience, transportation linkages, supply shortages, those actually pre-existed, but they became much more obvious and much more exacerbated during that period. And one of the tricks of what government has to do is, well, cyclically things might be happening in a way that are positive or in a benefit for broad economy. We always have to look under the hood and look at what the structural issues are. And indeed, Canada's industrial policy for a number of years was trying to address Canada's structural issues. And to it in addressing structural issues means that Canada can differently compete with those players who have much larger markets and who have a much bigger bank account to throw at their innovation and industrial manufacturing ecosystem. I mean, today, what I would say is we find ourselves in a very unique period in history. I would totally agree with that. It's always changing, and this particular period of time, I would agree, is definitely characterized the way I believe you did so very accurately. You know, there's escalated pressure to maintain or grow market share. That's always been the case for Canada, but then how one does that shifts relative to what one's competitors or even trade partners are doing. It's a very fast evolving market. So first, we've had others in the panel point out recent government industrial policies signaling their reorientation to globalization. One in which I do strongly believe geographic factoring supply chains is increasingly prominent. This is being manifest on a sector by sector basis. The macroeconomy is absolutely a good lens to look at. But when one looks down at verticals into the microeconomy, the picture is very differently featured from one to the other. And maybe I'll make a point on that a little bit later. Countries, I would say, including Canada, are now focused on value chain networks. We were before, but it's just a different flavor of it now. We would often, supply chains is being used, thrown about in many different contexts. It means many different things, but value chains is a much more broad terminology that includes intangibles and elements of an economic innovation ecosystem that brings value in a broader definition. I would say manufacturing right now is more than ever considered a competitive advantage and part of national security consideration. And certainly Canada has made a tremendous amount of effort, including in the context of COVID, to consider what our national security considerations are. I would say the most obvious of which is the enormous amounts of money and effort that's been put into increasing our capabilities in the life sciences, that we have a different level of end-to-end research and development to manufacturing and creation along, the drug and vaccine. Based on, 20 plus years of R&D that comes from our research institutes, that really makes Canada an unbelievable place in which to undertake different industrial activities. Of course, as my colleagues on the panel have mentioned, there's significant investment directed to decarbonization as a primary objective, but my argument would be that while that is absolutely the case, decarbonization can also wrap into it other innovations and motivations to incentivize new approaches to manufacturing, innovation, or development. And so countries like Canada, who are laggards in the use of advanced manufacturing technologies, robotics, automation, etc., the incentive to decarbonize, because there's a market incentive to do so, can also wrap into that different ways in which we can adopt other technologies. Many have mentioned what the United States are doing, 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It's beyond IRA. It is beyond that. 20 billion for semiconductor research and STEM efforts. European Union, of course, 600 billion for the Green Deal. I think it's worthy to mention CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is, it's not about direct spending, but it is about a differentiation between markets who are adopting decarbonization and who have lower carbon footprints in their goods for trade. And if that is not happening, then those markets and industries who are not doing that will be cut out of markets or have to increase the value of what it is they get in market. Of course, France has been doing a number of things, 30 billion, their investment plan, Australia, 15 billion for National Reconstruction Fund, and so on and so forth. You know, for Canada, you know, we have to set an environment, and we are trying to set an environment that makes us, a smaller economy, more attractive to put a new greenfield plant in or undertake new research that will end up becoming some value creation, enter the Canadian market, or maybe be exported out of the markets. We need an amazing regulatory system that is live and that can be responsive and not take, you know, decades to get to an approval to do, you know, mining X project or, you know, manufacturing plant Y project. We need market certainty. We recently had a budget in which there was a signal of a response to what's happening around the world. We increased our tax credits, and that is coupled with something that happens in my department, which is Canada's largest direct funding mechanism, the Strategic Innovation Fund. And the things that we have been able to realize as a result of the direct investment is incredible. One of the first projects I remember doing was was a partnership with Rio Tinto and uOttawa, two aluminum manufacturers who have a joint venture to develop and implement technology that would have Canada as the only country in the world who can smelt aluminum GHG free. And it's a billions and billions of dollars ever, but wow, does that put us in a different playing field when car manufacturers are looking for GHG free aluminum that correspond with EV batteries, that correspond with GHG free steel to make their bumper and bumper cars GHG free, or whatever you use on them. For a long time, we've been putting together a toolkit to do that. The other component of what of how we are thinking about, you know, changing our data, with whom we are having connections in our international relations, trade relations. We have an extremely strong relationship with the United States. I would argue, though, that while Trump was highly protectionist, I don't see that has having gone down. That has not, you know, the current administration is makes no bones about their orientation to be, you know, America first, and what that means for other countries is quite material, including to Canada. It's good that they're doing it for the environment. Everybody needs that, but it's still protectionism nonetheless. However, they're looking to Canada for a number of critical partnerships beyond what we already have in terms of our flows. So I'm responsible for critical minerals at ICET, and I work very closely with at NRCan. You know, we have $1.5 billion to spend on critical mineral investments along the value chain. Not only is the United States looking to Canada as a secure supplier of critical minerals, the rest of the world is as well. The United Kingdom, I was there recently in spring, and they have nothing. They have none. And they are an industrialized economy that is used to actually having the raw materials to fuel their economy or their trade. So this is a brave new world for many countries who have advanced manufacturing capabilities, but they do not have easy access to the materials which to make them, and all the critical minerals that are needed for decarbonization and the energy transition and digitalization are critical. And so for Canada, our consideration is how it is we add value to the maximum extent we possibly can while still maintaining connections to the value chains. So we have some approaches. We have highly considered sophisticated ways of thinking about the microeconomy and understanding our place in the world and knowing how to leverage what we have to the maximum extent we possibly can. Anyway, I can go on and on, but I'll just stop there.
That was really amazing. Such a tour de force. I think we have lots to come back to, too, but maybe two things. Just talk about the negative line that we first to speak more about what is different in terms of the national policy that we are seeing now compared to the continuation that's the government is always back. And second, where should we spend money on these projects or on a targeted intervention supply chains more worthwhile? Some things to think about. Sure, but before we do that, let's go to Martha. As I said, it is one of the leading thinkers on this in the business community, having authored this post together with a colleague, Gavin, who is actually here in the room as well. We should have been up here on the panel. So, Martha, having worked with the business community and helping the business community extend reshoring and reshoring. And what's your take? What are your thoughts?
Thanks very much. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Bonjour à tous et à tous. I also want to give thanks to my colleague, Ajin Sathanantham, for supporting on the materials that brought us here today. I'm a partner at the law firm of McCarthy Tétrault based in Toronto. My area of specialization is international trade and regulatory law. And so over the last 3 years in particular, our team has been extremely busy supporting our clients in the private sector in Canada and abroad, understand and react to major supply chain tensions, fissures, and sort of leveraging opportunities for our clients and helping them leverage opportunities to make critical changes to their supply chain networks in order to be able to react more quickly to global events. I don't have to mention the supply chain issues that we have all understood and experienced in the context of the pandemic. Those supply chain tensions continue today. We also, have unexpected environmental issues. A year and a half ago, there was that massive flood in British Columbia. Private sector in Canada that was relying on cross-country and through border services as between the US and Canada had to quickly determine how to move their ships around to get out west. And these unexpected type of global events that are really outside of political or bureaucratic control are important to think about when the private sector is considering developing deeper structures to their supply chain so that, again, they can react more quickly. From a private sector perspective, I can talk about what our clients and our sort of industry associations consider when we're talking about friendshoring. And friendshoring really is the key here for a good chunk of the private sector that we deal with in our practice, largely because onshoring may not be practical for the types of industries that we're representing on a day-to-day basis. And so really what our team has been looking to support in the private sector is supporting the private sector on increased increased reliance on quote unquote friendly nations. And what that means is we've determined is largely contingent on what sector the client is working in, the month of the year and where we are in the rollout of economic plans for the private sector. And that can change over time, and it can also change on a dime, as we've seen. And so one of the challenges is understanding who is a friendly nation at what moment and who is not. We've also heard from our clients that the concept of friendshoring means the potential for the importance of friendshoring kind of reduces some of that risk for what we might call unfriendly nations to leverage their trading relationships to drive foreign policy consensus that we may not like. We see that especially over the last year in the context of issues around Russia sanctions. It is a fact that Canadian business has been really engaged in driving changes around supply chain management, where there were key partners to those supply chain entities in and around Russia and now Belarus as well. And of course, looking to opportunities to support Ukraine in supply chain management as well, to the extent that one of our clients is large enough and has the reach to do that. And We have in the private sector also a recognition that there is a growing push in the US to build stronger domestic industries. And it's important that the private sector in Canada continue to remind our federal government, and I know that Minister Freeland has given a talk on this, a few talks on this, and seems, is very alive to this issue. But we need to remind the folks that are driving these multilateral and bilateral discussions with our neighbors to the south and around the globe relating to new trade arrangements that globalization is still key for Canada. We are a nation where our private sector, many of the largest entities in our private sector are actually not owned domestically. A lot of them are driven by US interests. They have parent companies in Europe, they have parent companies in the US. And so Canadian subsidiaries, which could be, really important employers in Canada, are often caught between the tension of Canadian trade policy and trade policies of their related entities abroad. And so, as I mentioned, we have seen Canada and the US. I know that Ms. Yellen also made some important statements to the impact of friendshoring and the ability of the US private sector system to engage in friendshoring as well as a priority. And we have seen also that the Biden administration has stated in a report on America's supply chain that the United States, of course, can't make or mine or manufacture everything themselves. And so they must cooperate with their allies and partners and foster these relationships to promote deeper supply chain relationships. And as it relates to risks and opportunities for the Canadian private sector, the biggest risk that we see on a day-to-day basis working with folks who are, literally on the field, getting an email that day saying the shipment's not coming, the dock is cut, there's something caught at the dock, shipment's been seized by Canada Border Services Agency. We just found out we have a Russian entity engaged in our supply chain that we didn't know about yesterday. We just found out that part of our goods, a material part of our goods is coming from China in the region of Xinjiang, which is now in many instances prohibited coming into Canada. How can we help our clients that find out on a Monday that their contract that's due on a Tuesday is going to take a tumble? These are real issues that the corporate sector deals with in Canada. And again, the biggest issue is uncertainty. One of the things that we talk about when we're looking at strategically supporting clients to rearrange their supply chain is how friendships, quote unquote, friendships might mature. How will our continued reliance on the US, and by the way, they are as reliant on Canada in many respects as well. What will that relationship look like in 2 years and 4 years? How would a Trump administration, for example, change some of the key determinations in the Inflation Reduction Act? Would that look like a more internal domestic policy, and would access to some of these advantages be reduced for our clients if there were a change in policy from a political perspective? The other risks include jurisdictional risk. How will we know about updates to friendshoring in policy? In many instances, Canadian policy will change retroactively. We see that in the context of Russia sanctions. The government will announce a new sanctions package, but announce that they will apply as of 3 weeks ago. So in that 3 weeks that have, started between the time that the contract was made and today, how does a company handle that retroactivity? And how do they look at their supply chains changing to handle that retroactivity? The biggest risk, practically speaking, from our clients' perspective in supply chain edits and management, frankly, is increased costs. At a high level, so shifting trade away from economies with more inexpensive labor and manufacturing costs, extraction costs, et cetera, is a risk from a client's perspective that is looking to diversify their supply chain management, but can only do so within the means of their economic model. And so in the clean energy context, we really try to support clients in understanding how tax credits can support them in that restructure of the supply chain. And certainly in the budget, we've seen a dramatic amount or a significant amount of money that put towards various issues that we believe will support the private sector in doing so. Massive opportunity in respect of clean energy subsidies, for example. So these are hooks that we can use to support our clients as they try to friendshore as much as possible. The other piece that we think about is, we talked about some of the disadvantages or some of the challenges. Well, what are the opportunities? And we see in our practice at the moment, the most important opportunity for supply chain management and for friendshoring for Canada in the private sector is the concept of ESG. And I won't go through, we've got limited time today, but really where a Canadian enterprise can shift some of its supply chain, even if the costs increase in some areas, for example, in transportation, or in labor costs, to the extent that those costs can be offset by taking advantage of certain subsidies. Compliance and good corporate citizenship from an ESG perspective means a lot in terms of dollars. Shareholders and competitors and consumers, we are holding the private sector to account now. We want to know where they get their supply from. We want to know information about their supply chain, and shareholders take management to task on those issues. In the environment, like reducing carbon footprint, the social aspects of friendshoring when you're working with political and jurisdictions that are considered friendly, and supply chain legal compliance. Very, very soon, I think it's today or tomorrow, we are going to have Bill S-211 coming into law, and that is a bill that will require some ESG disclosures on behalf of Canadian enterprises that are large enough to fit within the ambit of that legislation. And so friendshoring can really support Canadian private sector to actually comply with their local rules in Canada, and will give them an excellent opportunity to demonstrate their good corporate citizenship as a difference maker.
Thank you so much. That was excellent, and thank you for making it so practical. On the one hand, I think companies are really struggling, as you said. I appreciate that you gave us some hope as well as highlighted some of the positive opportunities there. We are a little bit behind schedule, so for Ranja, I would ask you to be as brief as you can, 4 minutes max. And let's look at some of the challenges and tension here. So President Patricia, so I think Cheryl said earlier that Canada should be the reliable partner for critical minerals. Do we really want to be that? It means we have to take a lot of minerals out of the ground. We might have to do this in areas where environmental degradation is particularly harmful, like the Arctic, where indigenous communities have solved. And maybe we're using technology that will be outdated by the time we are opening these mines, if we're moving to a new battery generation. So is it really worth it to go green in order to make this transition work, but being really pollutant in the process?
I think we have to look at that in the global context. I think regardless of the battery technology, whether it's lithium or whether it's sodium ion, there are uncertainties around where these technologies will land, but we do know that the energy transition will require a lot of minerals. The estimate is 4 billion tons of minerals. That includes all the steel and aluminum, EVs and windmills and so on, and turbines, but a lot of minerals. However, we have to contrast that with the amount of extraction that occurs in a fossil fuel-based economy. So annually, it's 4 billion tons of oil that's extracted. That's annual versus 4 billion tons of minerals from now to 2050. So the thing about the mineral intensity of the energy transition is that this is for the technology. Once mined, the source of the energy is wind and solar and renewable energies. So that I think that it's important to emphasize that as we enter into this discussion nationally around our role in this, that these minerals are required for getting to sustainable economy. The question is how we do it. So if we say, as the question suggests, that we'll let others do it instead of doing it here, we're essentially offshoring that mining impact elsewhere. I believe in Canada, we can be a model for doing it well, and we should be that model. We're a global leader in space. And so it's our challenge to make sure that the mines that are developed for minerals for the energy transition are meeting the highest standards here in Canada, and that they're developed with not just effective consultations with communities, in particular Indigenous peoples, but real partnerships with those local communities. In other words, that they have actual space and leadership roles in these projects. So there are huge challenges. No question. Ring of Fire is a strong example of that, with the risks around carbon emissions from mining in that kind of environment. But I think that Canada has that challenge to take, and an opportunity as well to show how this can be done well.
Very much that is inspiring. Cheryl, turning that to you. So, in addition to the critical minerals, where do you see Canada being the forefront of this transition? What is Canada's competitive? Canada, and especially looking at
Question. I'd already written down the answers to the question you asked me before, so frame it in that way.
Yeah, no, please.
By the way, you can also get critical minerals by not mining them. So in the production of aluminum, for example, you can get gallium. Is gallium amazing? Yes, because it goes into the production of semiconductors. Do we need alternative manufacturing to where it currently is now? Absolutely. It's a massive global risk. So there are ways in which you can find recycling. You know, I mentioned the UK, for example. They're going to probably try to become one of the world's leading recycler. That way. So where? I mean, Canada, I was just at the world's largest industrial trade fair, which is in Hanover, Germany, called Hanover Messe. It's like kind of spectacular, and little plug, Canada's going to be the partner country in 2025, so all of you should come. You know, Canada, you know, Indonesia was the partner country this year, and Indonesia had this interesting representation of like 7 sails on this tall ship. They had sailed to Vancouver when and that represents their industrial areas. It was a very good reminder for me to really fully understand and appreciate the country in which we live and in which we're able to help on economic policy. We have like an enormous number of industrial sectors for which we have global relevant assets, and that serve our domestic economy. From textiles and apparel to plastics and chemicals, steel, aluminum, manufacturing of equipment and machinery, food processing, critical minerals, autos, aerospace, defense, it goes on and on and on and on. And so in some ways, when we set up our industrial toolkit, you know, I mentioned the CIPS before, you know, it's agnostic of sector, because any sector could come and bring forward a project, any industrial project, and say, I want to do this in my sector because I want to do this better than anybody else, maybe in the country and possibly in the world. And so in some ways, that's the industrial footprint, understanding where they need to go to stay competitive. And when we do, you know, when we incentivize that kind of behavior, when we fund that, we're addressing some of the, again, like I said, the structural problems. Struggling with, like, you know, our companies don't become big enough. We don't often see the world as our market. It's like our neighbor, you know. So I get a little bit squirrely when I think we have to pit one sector against another. But there are certain priorities that the government's given. We want to decarbonize in serious ways for our industry. We're doing a pretty good job. Two steel companies alone, Algoma and ArcelorMittal Dofasco, got a six megatons of GHG reduction just by transforming those two footprints. So in some ways, our competitive advantage is by picking industrial areas in which we can transform to the clean environment, and in other ways, it's how do we make sure that we continue to take the amazing R&D and development of ideas from our research centers, and we actually have it handed off to the value creators who can then transform that into market-ready products. And we have a problem with that. We do a lot of the supply side stuff, and it's insufficiently picked up by the industrial side stuff. It's not, to me, it's less like what sectors, what areas. And by the way, we've done that in critical minerals. We've narrowed it. There's 3 areas. We'll focus in on those because, you know, you'll wheel yourself or you spread it too thin and you do it too badly. But in other ways, it's really about how do we address the structural problems so that we can actually get on every sector that we've actually invested tons of money in already in many different ways, tax or whatever, to get on with what they need. Anyway, that might have been long. Apologize.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think it echoed it quite well earlier, but yes, cheaping an opportunity as well. But of course, you know, if we look at the benefits maybe from decoupling, we see at least some investments being leaving China and small other countries in Southeast Asia. We see Chinese companies setting up shop in Mexico to get around their tariffs against China by the United States. So is Canada somehow benefiting from all this, or are we just not a relevant player in this reshuffling of
Well, I think the announcement we got not long ago is actually a good sign that yes, we can we can be a good place to invest and to the benefit of the company coming in and of course Canadians in general. So I think that was a very good it's a good indication of that. I think actually if you go back to even pre-pandemic, I think we had a really good value proposition when we're talking about potential investors, right? So our pitch was good, and despite the pandemic. Right, I think we still have a very good value proposition for potential investors, and this culminated in this with a lot of effort, right? So notwithstanding the difficulties and and coming out in all of that, Canada is a very good place to invest. So from that perspective, to me, nothing has changed, right? But of course, we should never rest on our laurels, and I think we still need to work. In this case, a lot of people, yes, do want a critical mineral, so we have a lot of work to do in terms of setting incentives in the right way, so that we also get the best out of it. But we have to work with partners. We have to work with our friends and our close friends on a day-to-day basis, right? That's the thing. You cannot just go at it when there's something that's going, wrong. It's a day-to-day thing, and I'm very happy Patricia mentioned the work of our colleagues at the Embassy of the United States. So they did a fantastic job at making sure that Canada was under the tent, I think you said, Patricia, into this, getting potential subsidies for EV vehicles produced in North America. So it made a bit of noise initially, but this is major, right? So, but it's just a testimony to the fact that you need to work on those relationships on a continued basis, not just when times are, something goes off tracks and it's wrong. One thing I want to point out, because we're talking about big investments and all of that, so M&Es very often, so that's all good. But our fiber is SMEs in the Canadian economy, right? So when I think about difficulties around supply chains or global value chains and whatnot, I'm kind of thinking about, I put a bit my trade commissioner hat or the people who work in the trade commissioner service and say, they deal mostly with SMEs. So how do we help our own, like the rest of the economy? Right, it's more than 90% of our companies are SMEs, right? So there's a role for government there as well, to help them. And I just want to give you one example quickly of innovation thinking, if you will, in fixing a supply chain issue quite recently. So someone at the Investissement Québec which had changed a tidbit their mandate and now has also export promotion in their mandate. Talking to one investor on one side, one company came in and said, oh my God, my shipment I got was the last one. I got the notification out of China saying, sorry, you're too small a player. We don't want to bother with you anymore. And my widgets are not, that's the last I have. What do I do now? If I don't get my widget, I can't produce, I can't export. But then Investissement Québec turned around and said, oh, but we've got these people not far away from here, an hour drive or whatever, that do maybe something similar in terms of it. So they put the two and two together and say, well, maybe by changing a bit the production here, we could satisfy the other company right there. So this is just a quick and small example that, sometimes, diversifying suppliers is one way to go. But sometimes it can be also closer to home if you have the right knowledge to share and the thinking behind it. So that's another way to go at it. So, but SMEs is
And it also puts an interesting new role of government. So matchmaking was situations if we have the right data. Martha, now turning to you, what is the advantages of Canada? It's one of the free trade agreements about the world, but at the same time we are very dependent on our southern neighbor reasons. As open, for instance, we've seen in the IRA to include more the allies, including the European Union and its benefits. So how do we navigate this?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm actually going to follow up on a couple of notes that Marie-France brought up with respect to SMEs. The way we would address that question probably is separate depending on who the particular entity is and the particular sector they're in. As it relates to larger clients that we have that are multilateral companies that have the ability to invest in the global economy in different ways than small and medium-sized enterprises, what we're recommending them to do and where we've seen some success, particularly in the apparel sector, is in the diversification of trade and supply arrangements. We have a number of examples where individuals and entities engaged in the apparel sector have moved away from some production and sourcing in China in favor of entering more the ASEAN market. The ASEAN group of nations, we have an introduction to negotiations with those nations on a free trade agreement, which would be extremely important for Canadian purchasers, suppliers, distributors, and manufacturers in that sector, because the geographic location to China is much closer than, let's say, the United States, where a lot of Canadian companies consider to be their friendliest trade partner. And their cost of production would be also very interesting for them to engage in those relationships. So what we're telling our clients now is get ahead of these trade arrangements and start negotiating your contractual rights and abilities with those nations. The same thing applies to India, and that's in multiple different sectors, including, for example, the food sector. And so we have clients that are looking at future trade agreements that are now being negotiated and trying to get ahead of them and develop their partnerships now, which is always a good strategic thing to do when you're looking at supply chain management. Duty-free entry to goods is huge for both small, medium-sized enterprises and large enterprises. As it relates to small and medium enterprises, typically what we say is stick with the U.S. and domestic. The cost of transportation from across an ocean can be prohibitive. And to the extent possible, continue to deepen your relationships with the U.S. Because we have the advantages that are offered under the CUSMA, because we have wonderful folks in our consular staff who can connect you with some interesting opportunities in the U.S., but keep an eye out for Buy American. I agree that it was very evident in the Trump administration that there was sort of this protectionist push and this insular push, but I agree it's not all that different with the Biden administration. It just might be a little bit more elegantly stated. So those are the key issues that we would say for free trade agreements. We help our clients get ahead of them, and generally speaking, that will almost always offer more security in their supply chain management.
Thank you very much. The audience should get ready for some questions. We have some time for at least a couple of questions, but let me turn to Nicholas for the last question. So if free trade agreements are potentially still interesting, but maybe not the most important tool in this new era of trade policy around supply chains. What are the tools? How is trade law and trade policy changing?
Well, I'm actually wondering whether they are not a very important tool, because if we look at examples of friendshoring policy, the best example, maybe prior to the IRA, is CUSMA. Because what did CUSMA do? It essentially used rules of origin to make it a friendshoring agreement. It's free trade agreements were allowed in the old era, but it was sort of seen as a step towards multilateralism. But CUSMA represents a step backwards, and in very concrete terms, how was that accomplished? Under the NAFTA, I think the average rules of origin for auto parts to qualify as originating was 62.5% regional value. The TPP that got down to 33%. So the TPP was really a liberalizing agreement. And under CUSMA, it went up to 75%. And the Trump administration originally wanted to go for 85%. So what is the effect of that? It is ensuring that more of the value is added within North America. And so we have to see that in conjunction with the IRA as one of the causes for the revival of manufacturing investment, I think, in North America. And so why don't we use FTAs, which are the best tool to do friendshoring, because they have an exception under the WTO. If you're concerned about WTO compliance, FTAs would be the way to go, because you have the carve out, there would be the way to go to do friendshoring. And I think the problem is here, it's the fact that we have international trade law in the United States. And as we think about the space, we tend to think about China as the problem, but for Canada and many other Western countries, it's really the US that is the problem in many ways, because there would be ways to do this through preferential trade agreements, which would be highly legal, which would create certainty, which would avoid all the protectionism, but it's really the protectionist turn in the United States which prevents that. And so, given that, and I mean, Canada is still trying to do FTAs. You mentioned ASEAN, India, Indonesia, the European Union is trying to use FTAs. The UK is trying to use them. So I wouldn't say that it's not a tool that's being used anymore. But of course, with the United States, it doesn't work. So we have to look to other tools, such as subsidies. Procurement is a tool where there are relatively few legal constraints on giving preferences. So that might be an area where Canada can try to implement friendshoring policies.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists for sticking to that tight timeline. So we do have time for some questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself. Yes.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask about the competence of government to price security of supply. Nicholas started by saying that's one of the prime movers of friendshoring, but it seems to me extremely difficult to analyze what it's worth to you. And I have a specific example. I have a client who makes microchips and is trying to repatriate his supply back from Taiwan and China to do it in Toronto. So we approach Cheryl's troops, by the way, very good people, but they're kind of scratching their head and they're saying, well, we don't know what that's worth. We know what employment is worth, but microchips are not really a huge employment generator. I thought that was a really challenging issue for administration, is how to establish what it's worth to you to be safer. Microchips, you know, as we saw in the last couple of years, have enormous impact across the whole economy, and almost all of ours are coming from one of the most fraught geopolitical parts of the world. So it's nerve-wracking.
Great question, and it's Warren Everson, right? You introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Warren Everson. I have a company called Saramac Consulting.
Who from the
I didn't mean to put you.
No, it's okay. Who within my department is the director of strategic thinking? Well, we actually do price things every day. So the VW deal that was priced, steel deals, aluminum deals. We price them all, and in part we're pricing them in a couple of ways. So one is, yeah, you're buying, in some instances, you might be buying PhD. In some instances, you are trying to maintain a footprint lest it goes somewhere else, and you're trying to, work out what is the actual value that will keep that there. It's become increasingly tricky, right, with the behemoths incentive package that is in the United States versus what's on offer in Canada. We generally do it on a deal by deal basis, and how we do it is we do market assessments, we do technology assessments, and we do financial assessments. So that's basically the formula, and each and every deal gets priced in that way. Now for smaller, those are, we do lots of big deals at ISED. Smaller deals are done by regional development agencies who basically take the same approach, right? They negotiate on a company like sometimes we undertake consortia deals as well, in which we're trying to figure out, you've got this many companies together, your objective is to do X, Y, and Z different things. How much money would get you there? And part of the deal is what you're required to do to get the money. And if you don't meet those objectives, then you cease getting money from us. And so in a way, it's a price leverage dynamic that we have. So the only way in which I think we can measure are we good at it or not is if we land a deal or if
we are running out of time, and I do want to give just a couple of minutes to Patrick also to wrap up here. So we have one quick question, and then maybe thanks. Please introduce yourself, and then each of the panelists has an opportunity to say 30 seconds of final words or responses.
Thank you. My name's Hong. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Public International Affairs. My question to you is on de-risking versus decoupling. So from a political narrative perspective, like they do seem quite distinct, but I was just wondering if, in practice, what you think that could or would look like.
Excellent question. So let me give my let's start with Carol, and then we go down.
I'll be super fast. De-risking is taking the edge off what the private sector wants to do. And so it's often a money issue where you're just paying down some of the cost. But it could be other intangible things like the regulatory environment is certain, or the trade environment is certain, or you can actually get your good from point A to point B. Decoupling, though, is the extraction of supply chain nodes from a current situation to a different situation.
That's exactly how I would describe it as well. Practically speaking, if we have that type of question from a client, what they're wanting to know is, should they remove themselves from a particular jurisdiction, or should they get out of contracts with suppliers from a particular jurisdiction, versus how can they diversify and de-risk the current supply chain to accommodate changes in law, to accommodate changes in policy, et cetera. So it's really around whether you're sort of strengthening and de-risking the current supply versus whether it makes sense for multiple reasons. And usually it's cost, whether it makes sense, or cost and also political and legal issues. Issues around Russia, for example, is the easiest to use as an example. Whether it makes sense to remove an entire jurisdiction from the supply chain to the extent possible.
I'll just pick up on some themes in both the questions, just to reiterate that the benefits of trade are such that costs are lower. We know that that's firmly established. So the degree to which there is decoupling and reshoring, costs will tend to go up, and from an environmental perspective, that will potentially slow the transition to clean energy. So I think that the happy middle where we all want to get to is more like diversification as opposed to reshoring, and that in diversification of supply chains, we find resilience, we find greater security, and we keep to the greatest extent possible the benefits of trade. So diversification, high standards, rules-based trade, I think those are the things we have to be present and remember the benefits.
I have a bit of a different take on the de-risking decoupling binary. I think the de-risking is what the Europeans like to talk about with respect to China instead of decoupling, but I think in actual practice, the differences are slight, because you always have to ask, what is the risk? And when when people talk about decoupling in the United States, they also don't say we have to decouple everything, right? Agricultural exports are continuing, so it's a very differentiated approach. You decouple in some areas like 5G and the internet, but and semiconductors, but you don't decouple in other areas. And de-risking is essentially the same. You look at, well, what is the risk? In some areas, the risk might be so high that you have to decouple. In other areas, it's not that high, so you can continue the trading relationship. And even in the risking, you may end up with complete decoupling, right? So if China invades Taiwan, we may end up, that risk is something that I think every company has to take into account. Well, what would happen in China Western trading relationship if China invaded Taiwan and we had Russia starts sanctions on China? And so you may end up, even if you just fall to say you're de-risking, if you take that risk into account, you may have to decouple.
So very quickly, so I agree, de-risking can lead to decoupling, so that's for sure. So costs on both sides. One can be more short-term maybe than decoupling, like to extract yourself from a node completely from the global value chain and reset something different. It's a very different game. And so sometimes it's easier when you build it from the ground up, like for the lithium batteries.
Much.
Right. Well, I will make this very quick. I want to thank our panelists and our moderator for an excellent discussion, very enlightening. I think we've made a bit of a headway in terms of understanding the issues around reshoring, friendshoring, decoupling, de-risking. I think there's a lot to think about as we respectively go forward in our various disciplines, fields, responsibilities. But I think certainly this was a very worthwhile event. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. I want to thank you for being here and staying a few more minutes than the schedule. So appreciate that. And thank you again. Thank you to the sponsors, the Center for International Policy Studies, the Tellier Chair, the Hyman Soloway Chair on Business and Trade Policy, and the International Political Economy Network. As you can tell, lots of people and institutions behind this, but I think it was a great success, and we wish you well and hope that we will have other opportunities to reconvene and continue these discussions, as certainly these issues are not going away. So thank you very much, and take care.